Thank you, Rico, for that nice presentation. You know, about 12 years ago, I was doing my first year of teaching at ITESO, the university I studied at Guadalajara. And one of my best students there was Andrea Alvarez, who is here, and she has become proudly a professional here, and she's a volunteer at the Dallas Architecture Forum, so I wanted to thank her first, and to Miguel and Daniel for being that bridge that brings our work here tonight. And of course, to thank Nate and Jean for their generous reception today, and to the Dallas Architecture Forum for opening this space to share a little of what we do from Mexico, a place, you know, so close and so linked to the US, but at the same time so contrasting and unique. Of course, thanks to all of you who have come to listen. It is indeed a great honor being here. I'm speaking on behalf of all of our studio, but especially on behalf of the three of us, the partners who did it. As Eurico said, Salvador Macias and I are the founders of the studio. That is why it has our last names on it. And eventually, our friend Diego Girarte joined us, and we became three. Salvador and Diego, like Nate said, happened to be here tonight. It was a happy accident, really, because tomorrow we are taking a flight in the morning, and the Fort Worth connection was necessary from Guadalajara. So even though we're here, we stick to the plan of me speaking as it was announced. So just wanted to let you know they're here. I mean, of course they will be here, but they're physically here. So we believe that a practice is shaped and built from many biographical factors, such as the place in the world it is established, where it is born, the meetings it has, the mentors, the references, the circumstances, etc., because they are also the filters through which you can relate to the world, and from there to be able to contribute something. In our case, it has also helped us to find affinity with the people who have collaborated with us, and also with those who come to us with the commissions we receive. We lead a studio that is based in the city of Guadalajara. Guadalajara is the second largest city in Mexico. And for us, something that has been very important is to be aware of who we are, why we look at things one way or another, and what is what we do. And Guadalajara has definitely influenced that. The great boom and growth of the city, as much in the world, came in the 20th century. Of all the architecture that the city gave birth at that time, the one that has interested us the most from the beginning was this one, the one of Mediterranean influences imported by architect Luis Barragán, who was born in Guadalajara, in his emerging architecture. He found that in that type of architecture, ingredients and values that were suitable for the weather and culture of Guadalajara, where the open spaces, the patios, the terraces, the porches, and gardens were especially remarkable. He used to say that architects should think as gardens, as houses, and houses as gardens. In the same way, our professors who had an influence on us when we were students of architecture and first architects with whom we worked also followed this tradition. They would also have in common the idea of taking care of the construction of the projects themselves. Two of the most influential for us were Sergio Ortiz and Hugo González, whose houses were made through their direction as builders. We learned from our teachers that there was a culture in our city of being directly on site, taking care of the good execution of things. The architect is not only generating ideas, is the general contractor and responsible of the construction process. much of the idea of architecture in Guadalajara relies on this careful execution. Execution that, from this side of the world, was giving them an experimental field full of rudimentary, artisanal, and local processes. Their universe was full of external references, but they always interpreted them with what they had at hand. And again, by embracing local conditions, they give support to the idea of pushing architecture very much to the outside. In the same way, we have thought that the main living spaces of houses can be the opportunity to be the terrace at the same time, a covered space that opens to the garden or patio. Just as our teachers understood, the weather has molded a certain way of living outdoors, meeting outdoors, rest outdoors. As in the case of this recent house, where the main space is under the shadow of a large pre-existing tree and in direct relation to the garden. The house can be understood as a folding and floating roof over a garden, a roof that promotes that the house relates constantly with the exterior without blocking boundaries. A garden that spills down to create and relate to a basement level. That way the house always relates to the ground and nature instead of having a second level. The folding roofs let pass natural light freely into interior spaces, as well as they allow constant visual contact to nature from the inside. Glass is just giving protection from the weather. The same thing happens in the extension of a house. One of our very first projects was precisely to design a terrace in Guadalajara. For an all-purpose and flexible space, we recalled the modern pavilions of single levels and open plans. A structure that will allow special continuity among the existing natural landscape. But like our professors, we wanted to challenge ourselves first on trying to have a material dialogue with nature, and second, on taking it as an excellent excuse to work with local techniques. Carpenters making the structure and stone cutters shaping and accommodating every stone in a technique called rajuela, hoping we could create, with the help of nature, a new landscape. From the very first years of our practice, we understood that in order to start an independent practice in the city, we had inevitably to force us to build our initial projects. About 14 years ago, one of our first commissions was to turn this 1950s house into offices for rent. During the renovation work, we realized that beneath this surface, handmade brick walls were perfectly well executed. But it had been completely covered because of a pretension of being global, in this case, modern. The value was not behind how well it was made, it was in belonging to an aspirational language. In this accidental revelation, we felt that the only thing we needed to do was to expose this traditional system. We found a great value and beauty in this. But the important was to realize that we lived in a city of artisans, where an important part of the population is dedicated to craft work of all kinds. And that construction was not exempt from this. It is today a place where the possibilities of handmade construction are still viable and at a reasonable cost. We became aware that we had a great opportunity behind this direct relationship with the craftsmen because they were our staff. That is, we not only had a few collaborators at the studio, we had employees on site, and we were in charge of leading them all. We allowed ourselves to react to the unknown, but also many times to experiment and to learn to listen and let ourselves be advised. From that moment, locality played a key role on our practice. We began to realize that having this relationship with an extraordinary workforce could become a way of doing and understanding a personal architecture. In addition to the idea of space, we felt eager to do projects that manifest this awareness of locality and the idea of doing good, executing well. To think that we could conceive an entire new house of an exposed brick from the beginning, a brick that was specially baked for a specific measure to contain the structure, an artisanal luxury that can still be done in Guadalajara. In these first houses, we felt the need to leave some witnesses of this, leaving certain isolated bricks sticked out from the facade to show that they are not a coating, but part of an entire system. A house we designed a decade ago with our friends Denis Salvador and Miguel Valverde, who I'm happy to say is also here tonight. And the same with all the wood structure, the carpentries, and all interior crafts. As in the case of this house, where we wanted to be there to define what kind of plaster we wanted, experimented with the master masons with pigments and additives to get the right stucco, or how to make precast concrete beams on site, testing concrete formworks so they could later connect to the rest of the structure, or how to make that ordinary clay brick became waterproof and fade its reddish color by preparing a liquid mixture in which each one of them could be baptized before assembling. Being part of the performance of the building process has not only made us do things in a certain way, but also has made us think and relate to architecture in a certain way. As the studio started growing, and we were no longer able to take care of the demanding building process, we needed to leave behind the contractor role. And now, with our building teams, we have been able to keep on this research. This house is still under construction, but it has been certainly a project which has allowed us to go further in the experimental field of the building process. This time, we were able to mount a little brick and beam factory within the plot just for the project. We allow ourselves the freedom to make cement bricks, the size, the format, and the color that was best for the project. As soon as we found the right recipe for the bricks, manufacture started. And as they were being made, they were being placed. All the logistics to do this has been impressive. We have enjoyed seeing all of that effort printed out on the volumes of the house. So we still do not imagine doing a project where we are not involved in the building process, because we have become ourselves in a way, are gotten used to maybe, in which we end up defining many situations directly on site in the process. Every time this awareness of our context is now its own ways of doing became stronger for us. It is directly related to the way we create as much as the way we undertake the building process of architecture. In this sense, it is interesting to see how the first exercises of vertical housing in the city were like this. This is the example, made with the same rudimentary wall system than a common house. It may look like 5 houses were stacked up, and those who did this were the architects, the developers, and the general contractors at the same time. Something that seemed very ordinary now seems extraordinary to us when we have left the city and see that in other places it hardly exists. These examples of the 60s and 70s keep catching our attention. So when we were commissioned our first vertical housing building in the city, we thought if it was possible to make a building with all the contemporary conditions, but made with a wall system. Could it be possible to consider this despite the current conditions, time, economy, and construction system preferred by housing developers? In this exercise, we proposed a system of concrete walls that carry the entire structure of up to 8 levels. It is not made of columns or concrete frames. It is made of walls that support the entire building. With concrete walls, we managed to create free spaces inside. And we created controlled openings to reduce the impact of noise of large avenues and achieve greater intimacy. In this another housing building, the operation was the same, an architecture made of walls, cutting out openings. The wall is the one that dominates and tries to show how things have been done in Guadalajara, regardless the change in scale. And when walls reach the ground floor, something interesting happens. They turn into arcs, so they can transfer the load into columns that come underneath at the basements. Arcs that also allow us to relate to one of the most traditional areas of the city, where we can find those first houses of the 30s and 40s of Luis Barragán and his closest colleagues, like this one, Casa Fara by architect Rafael Ursúa. When we were invited to the architecture school at Rice to reflect on housing in Guadalajara, we made this collage of the house, repeated many times, to bring to the table the critical question of how to embrace the idea of domesticity, also from the configuration of the interior space. Piling houses is an open exercise that we are still exploring, trying to give a more solid meaning to this idea, because we are interested in our city. And now, I would like to move to another level of interpretation of our context, the wider context, Mexico as a country. It has not only been about understanding and interpreting our city, but it has also interested us very much to look at the Mexican context through the eyes of others, through people that saw our territory from the outside and for whom Mexico was a great influence. Between the three of us, there has always been a common interest about the primitive and the vernacular that keeps captivating us until now, an interest that we shared with these two German artists who became research projects for Salvador and myself on our master degrees in Barcelona. On the left side, we see Joseph Albers, famous Bauhaus teacher, and on the right, Matthias Goeritz, who came to Mexico to introduce some of the principles of the Bauhaus into the schools of architecture in Mexico. Both of them visiting here the ancient city of Teotihuacan. From them, we learn an extraordinary capacity of analysis and synthesis, of distilling and abstracting what they saw. For example, Albers took these photographs during his many trips to Mexico in the 1940s. He took hundreds of them, and later they served as an abstract studies of form and geometry. We can see Albers with his students showing them a diagonal in those drawings, like the diagonal of the Mexican pyramids seen from above. And on the other hand, the sculpture of Goeritz, always influenced by this primitive and so rooted Mexican monumentality and landscape. Actually, Goeritz used to say that Mexico is a country where everything is possible. Something that has interested us about him is to understand how a foreigner becomes local by understanding the environment where he works. This image on the left is the only piece of architecture that Goeritz ever made, the Experimental Museum of El Eco in Mexico City. It was an architectural manifesto against the Mexican rationalism in architecture of the 50s that he named emotional architecture. That is why the walls of the museum are diagonals that never reach 90 degrees. We had the opportunity to develop a temporary intervention to the patio that enabled other ways to use the space. So we thought that we could establish a relationship with the building a new diagonal. By lifting the whole floor of the patio, covering it with exactly the same clay floor of the courtyard, the same Gerritz was sitting on working. And by that, we were able to build a new piece with a memory of its original condition. With this, we could erase the short wall that divides the museum and the street, building a bridge, a viewpoint towards the park that is in front of it. This was the question: was it possible to silently promote a different reading of the same space, the same floor, same material, just by giving it another quality? And after this, an invitation to do another similar exercise came at the gallery called Liga in Mexico City, an intervention that somehow showed our interests when doing architecture, where again we wanted to see what was there with a deeper, almost foreign look. And again, we turned to the floor, in this case of black volcanic stone. We discovered that in order to obtain this commercial laminated floor, irregular stone from the mountain had to be manipulated. The pieces you see over that truck are the leftovers of that process. They are stone waste. We brought 33 tons of those leftovers to the small gallery, and with that we rebuilt the space, filling it in almost completely, leaving only a small concavity, celebrating the effort that makes this stacking work possible, and seeking for that rooted abstraction capacity of our foreign artists, Albers and Gerritz. As it also happened to us in San Luis Potosí, a very important industrial and mining zone in the country, where we found several industrial ruins and abandoned towns on the outskirts of the city, like the one we see here called Cerro de San Pedro. In this city, we won the commission of an office building that we made in collaboration with Manuel Cervantes' studio. We had to excavate 3 basement levels deep into the hard stone. There was so much stone that they had to make stone donations around the city, and with that, we are also now running a house in the surrounding area. What we were looking for was that from the ground downwards, the new concrete structure merged with the excavated stone, causing an intimate relationship between them, one maximizing the other. And as it rose upwards, the building evoked an aspect of vestige that remembered those old mining industries or haciendas of the surroundings, with the emblematic pink soil and stone. We imagined that the project could be one more ruin like the others we found, and in this way, coexist with the arid, rocky, semi-desert landscape. As if this had always been there. Again, as foreigners, trying to build a dialogue with the place. In this case, the commission was about creating factories in the landscape of Jalisco, a place surrounded by farms, barn roofs, mesquite trees that cohabit with the clay and rocky soil, a landscape that could easily be described in many Mexican tales and stories. On one hand, we sought for the factories to adapt themselves to the natural topography. And on the other, that the color of the structures somehow imitated the ground of the place. While outside the walls and reinforcements recall other pre-existing structures in the area, inside, some patios allow the adequate light for industrial work. And then, perhaps the richest, most exuberant and inspiring place in which we have worked in Mexico, the Yucatan Peninsula, where we have learned a lot about the exteriority of architecture, how to a great extent the pre-Hispanic platforms and structures, the colonial atriums, and the haciendas are devices to see and receive natural landscape. Jordan Utzon already talks a little about it in Platforms and Plateaus, a reminder of his travels to this area. In this complex near Tulum, both the Access Building and the rest of the campus remind us of that, which has been very important for us. This means that the buildings are defined as large step planters that we hope one day will completely blend in with the site. And towards the interior, that they never stop having a relationship with that landscape, not only through a window, but also through the entire roof. Or like in this group of houses, also at Tulum, where to preserve and protect the natural reserve of this property was the most important aspect. That is why we went for the least footprint over the ground for the houses, and from there went high to meet all the program that was required. We had to bother users going up and down in the best way possible. And as the house goes up, it also steps back, so your relation with the jungle remains. As you get out from each level, you have visual contact with nature. Again, as happens in the platforms and buildings of the Mayan pre-Hispanic sites all over the peninsula. Architecture tries to give support to natural landscape, as architecture allows you to distance yourself, as it allows you to inhabit and observe, then connection with nature is immediate and intimate. Here we have reached the highest level of the house, where the jungle has almost left below, and the connection now is with the wider context and the sky. Outer space here has a lot to do with water and contemplation. And it has to do with shadow, in the case of this wider terrace at the lower level. And at the most intimate spaces, that relationship becomes optional and flexible. You can keep windows open or closed, and or step out to the balconies. We are interested in recovering things from the place, abstract them, and use them to feel we can be part of a greater context, away from the singularity of the object of architecture. We believe in history as a mechanism that makes possible to create buildings loaded with knowledge. History is not something rigid. You have to have creativity to take advantage of it. If we want to make conscious, sustainable, and logical architecture, we need to learn from the understanding of the place through history. There we can find the keys to make an architecture that really belongs to a place, and to read our present at the same time and make history useful. In that sense, we feel to bring things to the table and make them relate each other if they are appropriate for a specific case without preconceptions. Here we are relating images taken from books we have, which have similar techniques, all made by hand, but which come from completely different authors, times, and places. This collage is a new piece made from fragments of other documents. We imagine ourselves creating architecture projects like this. Here we put on the same level and same imaginary site the traditional Mayan hut that after 2,000 years remains being used on the Mayan region of Mexico, and the paradigmatic farmwork house, which curiously and compared to the other doesn't work as a house anymore. We like to think that these two architectures are not so distant. We wanted to communicate that beyond technique, there are no significant differences between them. We like to believe that through history and tradition is how our work establishes a continuity, which means it doesn't begin from scratch, not interrupts, but conciliates the site's history with its present. And now that we have mentioned the Mayan hut, when we were invited to make a small hotel in the island called Holbox at the Mayan zone of the country, we thought of the Mayan hut, where the structure of the roof, made of cedar, reinterprets the original roofs of the Mayan huts that allow flexibility and the resistance of hurricanes. So the walls mark the limit of the horizontal space, and the organic structure of the roof delimitates the vertical space. So what we have here is a collage of two architectures in tension, a light woven traditional handmade one at the interior, and a solid white and abstract one at the outside, where you are surrounded by this massive landscape. We like to think that now the Mayan huts are fluted and their communication is through the water. We even proposed a viewpoint tower to overlook the island. And on one hand, it reminds us of this Palenque Palace, one of the structures that most interest us in the Mayan area. And on the other hand, a reminiscence to a contemporary small skyscraper placed at the edge of this triangular plot. These are the kind of contradictions and dualities that confront us and that attract us to address. Vone X, a talented French architect from the studio of Productora, defined her practice with this drawing and a writing he entitled "A Stick on a Beam," something taken directly from nature, broadly transformed against a concrete beam that requires certain technique to be possible. And we enjoy it because it talks about an ability to bring things together even though they might be totally opposite. In this house in the Pacific Ocean we designed with Co-Arquitectura, there was a demand and a desire to use traditional thatched roofs from the locality. But we also found that a mud building could be an extraordinary strategy to guarantee a visual continuity of the landscape and the sea horizon without interruptions. We wondered if we could make both systems work together in a contemporary way. And so we did. A concrete structure would rise from the ground all the way up to meet the organic structure. We were amazed on how much a fixed concrete structure, when in contact with an organic one, can cause such a different reading of both, especially when there is such a clear structural correlation between one and another, as you can see here. Our architecture collage. But for a house confined among many other houses, we thought about a cloister. We wanted to look for that central void and horizontality at the same time, like the image of the brickyard on the left, or like the horizontality of Frank Lloyd Wright's Prairie Houses. The open space becomes the heart of the project and the main garden, unlike the conventional cloisters of monasteries, where the patio is the border is bordered by a semi-open corridor. Here, that border space is mostly becomes the interior of the house. And in this other case, becomes a terrace. The central void is a kind of large distributor without a roof, without use, where the only purpose is to live the experience of looking at it or going through it. And this is how we build ideas, starting from fragments of the past and the things that we see, things that we apply and adapt. Sometimes it has to do with a constructive system, sometimes with the space, with the site and the context, or with a certain language. In contrast to the rigor demanded by construction and good execution in architecture, we believe that when it comes to imagining, one has to know how to let go of that. Joseph Ketlas says that the game is not an unreflective or spontaneous activity. It is an operation that has to be done consciously. Games have rules, but we also believe that the good player is the one who really enjoys the game. Once he knows the rules, never think about them again. This is a significant handmade clay plane we acquired in a craft market in Peru. We like it because it has the shape of an airplane. However, it doesn't fly. It only represents the idea of flying. We see the transnational sign of Air France, but also Peruvian flags and native Peruvians aboard. It's a toy, but it's fragile and heavy. Among all these contradictions, the serious idea of an airplane becomes an object of playing. Actually, we like to think that whoever made this plane was also playing and using certain amount of spontaneity and freedom. We like to think that we can make clay airplanes. And like this, playing, we undertook the adventure of a Montessori school in Mazatlan, invited by our partner friend, Eric Perez. Where we only had 6 months to design and conclude the first stage of the master plan before the coming school year began. Maria Montessori proposed that the teacher should not be a frontal authority, but a guide who moves around children. The center is the scenario for everything to happen. The most basic concentric classroom was then transformed into a hexagon based on the 6 Montessori learning areas. We established a grid and played with as many hexagons as we could fit into the plot, testing the relationship they could have and what kind of voids were resulting from that. We thought the philosophy behind the building was the most relevant aspect. The project was just a stage for this to happen. We established an internal body as interior space and an external one which would create an in-between space and a covered circulation until we got our final master plan. The second layer of the building was key to the project. First, because it allowed us to relate to children in a different way. We wanted to challenge the idea of crossing from one space to another through a special opening for them and for teachers. One that gives scale, but also that questions the conventions that children have about a door or a window. But why would they should be squares or rectangles? And secondly, because through controlled openings, we could pressurize wind to achieve an important cooling effect and deal with the high temperatures of the coast city of Mazatlan. The school is full of corners, passages, spaces of all kinds for children to decide what to do with them, to play all over them. We hoped that by playing, they would find it playful too. Or in this existing house, where we had to preserve the first part intact, because it belongs to a group of houses of a historical moment of Guadalajara. The area of free intervention that was left behind was a deep void trapped by the walls of neighboring houses. Once having taken care of the first section of historical protection and having crossing it, we could think of any strategy we wanted. It seemed logic to set the rule of not having walls. The game was not about suffocating space anymore, but to open it. How to gain as much oxygen and light as possible? That was the question. We thought, let's don't have any vertical structure. Let's play with suspended beams. Beams that run all the way to the sides. Here you can see how the vegetation has grown all over them. And in here, how the entire new program was suspended from these slabs or shelves. Here we see the connection between the existing spaces and the clear span new spaces. The stairs start right in that transition. Despite having so few square meters, light and ventilation flow freely through all these elements. Or this very similar case, also conditioned by the perimeter of neighbors, where it was necessary to build 4 levels for 3 different houses. So each one of the slabs had to have different openings, a gradient of light coming vertically through the building. We were challenged by the idea of bringing natural ventilation to as many spaces as possible. Maybe it's easier to see the strategy we played at from the vertical communication of the building. And as one walks up and down the building can find all kinds of open spaces in all different houses and levels. We managed that almost all spaces of the project had natural ventilation and light through open patios. Behind this rational building actually lies a strategy. What we designed was the structural scheme and the modulation, so that each unit had total freedom to propose its interior layout. The facades then are simply the result of the interior proposals of each house on each level. The only thing we designed were the rules of the game. In this project, we feel that we are starting to get closer to that piling houses idea that has stuck with us. And lastly, we believe that architecture should celebrate life and the events that take place in it. No matter what kind of activities, for us, it will always be an opportunity to build a scenario that promotes events, spaces that promote different activities. And imagine that people can grab and borrow these spaces and decide what to do with them. Of course, we are concerned about architecture in terms of structure, order, geometry, and space. But to imagine situations in and around them is a question that is always stimulating to answer. Sometimes the most meaningful experiences happen in spaces like these, where the use is not that specific. As it happened in this house, where the pre-existing nature was the perfect setting to build experiences instead of building roofs. And life happens here. Meetings take place under the shade of this big tree. Or here, where the commission was only to design a security point to control vehicular and pedestrian access to a small group of houses, to surprise pedestrians with an overhead light and the opportunity to make a little public space that, as trees were getting bigger, pedestrians could have a moment of rest and shade. Or how, with such simple actions like in the Eco Pavilion, is possible to promote a forum. Or from the street, how the unexpected happened, visitors of the museum overlook, and an ice cream vendor makes a sale. Rooftops with high walls can build shady spaces. One can feel there is a ceiling when there isn't, and enjoy outdoor activities under the sun. Or how, by absorbing the cost of building more facades around units, the reward is to enjoy natural lighting and ventilation for home activities. Especially when talking about housing buildings, places between the facade and the interior can be the stage for outdoor life. When thinking of car basements and lobbies as clear span spaces, we hope they can transcend their specific use like this. No matter how big or small the scale is, the capacity to enjoy nature as part of the everyday life, with comfort and with freedom at the same time. Or again, with the children here, how they use the covered hallways as an extension of the classroom, hiding from the intense sun of the tropical coast or isolating themselves for a little while. And within the classrooms, how all kinds of happenings are taking place, led by the form of the space, always promoting the idea of center. The children were asked to draw their house and their school, but surprisingly for us, the difference was that when they drew their school, they were able to do it just like it is. This meant a lot to us because they were not trying to find an archetype to represent a school, like a kid would do for a house. They were drawing their own school. More than any other project, we realized here that architecture still has the power to mean, to communicate. We want to make a pause on these kind of moments that give a deeper, different meaning to what we do. A special reward that encourages us to keep on doing architecture. Thank you very much.